Okay. All right. Hello and welcome to the fourth roundtable on India's residential electricity consumption. Hope everyone is okay, and we are really glad that you are joining us today. This roundtable is being jointly organized by Center for Policy Research, Prayas Energy Group, and the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development, University of Oxford. And we have been having this roundtable for last 3 years now. And well, we are calling it roundtable because the first two versions of it were kind of a closed group discussions between researchers. But last year it was a public event, and it was open to all. And the reason that we decided to focus on residential electricity demand is because it is expected to grow significantly because of almost universal access, increasing income, and urbanization. And it is crucial to understand the contours and trends of this demand in order to inform the policies to meet and manage the demand. So we have been holding this roundtable for last 3 years now, so that people can come, share their work, and then discuss on challenges and direction of research, and then how this research can inform various policies. So this year we'll have two sessions. Today is the first session where we'll focus on the rural residential electricity demand. And the second session will be on 7th October, next Thursday, and that will focus on opportunities of demand response in Indian homes. So today's session, the reason why we focus on rural residential electricity demand is that we have almost universal electricity access, but the use of electricity for applications beyond lights and fans, it's still limited. And increase in the use of electricity for these purposes can serve two purposes. One is to improve the standard of living through increased comfort, increased entertainment and information, as well as less drudgery by using these appliances, as well as it also improves the viability of supplying electricity. So it's very important to understand what are the factors that are driving this demand and what can be done to influence it. So, and that is also an area where very little research or limited research has been done, and that's why we wanted to focus on this today. So the way we are going to go about it is we have about 1.5 hours or so. And my colleague Shweta Kulkarni, she will give a very brief presentation to set the context for today's discussion. And then we'll have about 3 presentations, about 10 minutes each, dealing with different aspects of the rural residential electricity demand. And then there will be a combined Q&A session at the end. So if you have any specific questions on the presentation, please use the Q&A box to ask those questions. If there are very specific questions, panelists may reply them in the Q&A box itself. If they need a more elaborate response, then we can take them up at the end. So that's that. And without any additional delay, I'll hand it over to Shweta for her brief presentation. Over to you, Shweta.
Thank you, Aditya. And a very warm welcome to all of you today at the roundtable. It's also a pleasure to host 3 esteemed panelists, speakers for the roundtable today. I will quickly run through a very short overview slash presentation that we put together, which is to understand what the rural residential electricity demand situation looks like. So I think one is from the research that we've been conducting in the recent past, we are seeing that there is limited data available on rural residential electricity demand. Some authentic resource, being the CEA Annual General Review, has provided data only for 2009 and 2010, which is split for rural and urban residential areas. Secondly, we also do not have any nationwide rural electricity or energy consumption surveys, which could give us an estimate on what the demand actually looks like. The only sources that we have are some representative data set surveys that have been conducted by various organizations, one also being Prayas. And other than these data sets, focused efforts on projections based on modeling efforts are also being conducted to estimate the demand, specifically in rural areas as well as in urban areas. The presentation that we put together is more of a review of literature and data sets to get a better picture of residential electricity demand. This is a work in progress that we are currently involved in. And hence, we just request to not cite this, as all these numbers are more, sort of pulled in together from different sources. Now, like Aditya just mentioned, is that residential electricity demand has certain drivers, and they are very important to make estimations and also finally policy implications that they have. One is to understand appliance ownership and usage. Second is the electricity tariffs, how it impacts residential electricity use and the appliances that people can purchase owing to incomes and also their price sensitivities. And finally, what impact does supply quality and reliability have on usage of appliances and purchase of appliances? So just a very quick overview on the residential electricity consumption situation like. So what we see is that the number of households is certainly set to go up in the coming years. All the numbers for 2021 and 2030 and 31 have been taken from PEER, which is a projection based model that Prayas has been working on. And the numbers for 2020 and 21 are also projections. So the projections show that the number of households are significantly going up, both in rural and in urban setup. The per capita annual consumption is also significantly going up. And what is interesting is that the share of the rural per capita annual consumption remains close to half of that of urban per capita consumption. Whereas the annual consumption share of residential areas, urban and rural put together or even separately, remain more or less the same in comparison to other sectors across these years. Moving on, this is some other sources of data that we put together. The bar charts in striated pictures are again projections from the PEER effort at Prayas. Whereas the brown bar is the data that is gathered from the NFHS survey around 4 and the IRIS survey conducted by CEW. What is again interesting here to see is that the penetration of space cooling appliances is almost remaining similar or growing a little larger in rural areas, especially for ceiling fans. However, significant chunk in terms of space cooling comes from urban, but penetration in terms of air conditioners for rural areas is also set to go up significantly by 2030-31. Similarly, in terms of refrigerator share, the rural share of refrigerators still remains controlled or similar across these years. And what this is showing is that the appliance purchase and usage may really, as in the projections may really not show or talk about the demand in terms of electricity that can come from these areas. Finally, again, referring back to the electricity supply monitoring initiative that we did at Prayas, sorry for this, we see that the average supply hours in rural areas remains around 16 hours. And what is also critical to see is that there are very high number of voltage variations that occur in the rural areas, which can prevent people from making meaningful use of electricity for appliance usage and otherwise. And one other important factor that we've noted from the supply monitoring initiative is that most of the outages that occur in rural areas happen during the day, which can also be a limiting factor to make meaningful use of electricity. So I'd like to stop here. This is just to give a very brief overview of what the rural supply situation and appliance penetration and demand looks like. So I will hand it over to Aditya to take this further. Thank you.
Thanks, Shweta. So this was just a very, this was to lay down the context, and we'll explore more of the details in the subsequent presentations. So our first speaker is Shonali Pachauri. She is a principal research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA. And she has worked extensively on access to modern energy services and technologies and its wider impact on sustainable development, focusing on developing world, including India. So today, she will talk on her recent work on modeling household energy demand using a new method and also its policy implications for India. Over to you, Shonali.
Thank you, Aditya. And yeah, thank you very much to the organizers of this for inviting me to speak a little bit about our recent research. The work that I'm going to be sharing with you today is based on a new publication of ours that was just out. And I'd like to first give a shout out to my colleagues who have basically been responsible along with me for this publication. So these are listed here, and you can see very clearly that it was a big effort. So I just want to sort of briefly mention what are our main objectives in this work. So the work was really to try to understand the drivers of preferences for energy services and demand, and to analyze how these could change in the future across different population groups. As we know, electricity becomes more easily accessible, reliable, and affordable. And to do this, we kind of developed a highly granular bottom-up residential appliance and energy demand model. And we estimated this using microdata from national household surveys. And we assessed a number of alternative reference scenarios, basically following the shared socioeconomic pathway or SSP narratives and climate mitigation policy scenarios. Now, what we found was that between 2020 and 2050, we could see a doubling or a tripling of residential electricity use in South Asia, depending on what scenario we consider. So here we have the three reference scenarios, the shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios, so SSP1, SSP2, and SSP3. And SSP1 is a very sort of sustainable development pathway, or sort of the most optimistic pathway in terms of economic growth, inequality reduction, and urbanization. SSP2 is kind of a middle of the road pathway, and SSP3 is a more pessimistic pathway in terms of slower economic growth, higher population growth, lower urbanization, and higher inequality. And what's very evident from the analysis is that basically economic growth and urbanization have a much bigger effect on residential electricity use as compared to population growth, because in fact, SSP3 has a higher population level and a lower urbanization level than SSP1, for instance. However, if we look at the distribution of electricity use in residential sector, even in 2050, we see that over 2/3 of the population would probably continue to use less than 5 gigajoules per capita, which is sort of less than 1400 kilowatt hour per capita per year. And there is sort of quite a lot of inequality in terms of residential electricity use distribution, with, as you can see from this graph, most of the population using less than 10 gigajoules per capita, even in 2050. Now, of course, if we start breaking this down more to understand what is the access to electric services that this level of consumption is associated with, again, we see that there are sort of quite vast differences across the reference scenarios. So the SSPs as shown here in the graph, and this differs quite significantly between rural and urban areas, and also between the types of electric services we consider. So for instance, entertainment and communications, which include things like televisions and mobile phones and so on, we see that even in rural areas, there aren't that many that will lack access to this in 2050. Most of the population will have access to these services. But when we think about services associated with thermal comfort or food conservation and preparation, then particularly in rural areas, there will be many who may still lack access to these, even in 2050, and particularly so under the more pessimistic SSP3 reference scenario. So again, sort of breaking this down further to look at ownership of certain key appliances, we see that for things like refrigerators, most of the urban population would probably have access to these. But in rural areas, depending on the reference scenario, you might have only less than half having access to up to 80 or 85% having access in a very optimistic growth scenario. Personal computer ownership, again, we see sort of quite high ownership levels in urban areas across all three shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios. But in rural areas, again, there could be quite wide range of ownership depending on the reference scenario. Air conditioner ownership, this is sort of similar to kind of results that we've seen earlier from Prayas that were presented right at the introduction. So in urban areas, this could be much higher, but in rural areas, even under optimistic growth scenarios, we see very low ownership of air conditioners, even in 2050, with most people relying more on fans. And finally, washing machine ownership, again, quite high saturation levels in urban areas, but relatively low saturation, particularly in pessimistic growth scenarios in rural areas. So coming to my conclusions, basically what we found is that income and urbanization drive access to services. And we see that there's a rapid rise in demand, though inequalities in home energy use and appliance access are likely to persist till mid-century and beyond. So we see that even under optimistic scenarios, about 2/3 of the South Asian population will likely use less than 5 gigajoules per capita in homes. Up to half the population in rural areas could lack access to services associated with thermal comfort, cleaning, and food preparation and preservation. And efficiency improvements can slow down demand growth, particularly in energy intensive uses. So this is sort of just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we did in this work. We also explored some climate policy scenarios, but I haven't presented the results from that. The key takeaway from that result is really the fact that the prices of electricity don't change very significantly till 2050, even under ambitious climate policy scenarios. And these, of course, affect the purchase of electricity, but not so much the purchase of appliances. So they don't affect access to electricity services as significantly as one might have thought. So with that, I'd like to stop, and I'm happy to take questions and comments later. And thank you again for your attention.
Okay, great. So good, it was in 8 minutes, well below the time limit. So what we'll do is that will leave more time for the questions later on. So we'll move on to Namrata. So Namrata Chindarkar is she's an associate professor at the JSW School of Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Management, IIM Ahmedabad. And she works on sustainable development and social policy and has examined various topics, including access to energy, household and individual welfare, and gender and development. So today she will talk on her recent work on price elasticity of electricity demand in India, and also touch upon quality of supply and consumer satisfaction and how it impacts India's rural electricity demand. So over to you, Namrata.
Thank you, Aditya. And thank you to Shweta and to Shonali for their presentations, because it really sets the scene very well. I'll start sharing my screen now. Okay. So I want to get straight into the two questions that I'm asking here. And both of these are based on work which has already been done by me and my co-authors. So the first question is regarding tariffs, and how much do tariffs matter when it comes to determining rural residential electricity consumption? And in this research, along with my co-author Nihid Goel, what we do is we use the NSSO data over 5 rounds, which spans from 2005 to 2012. And we estimate a range of price elasticities, not only for rural households, but here what I'm discussing are only the relevant elasticities for rural households. So some of the findings that I want to highlight here are, first and foremost, even at a comparable level of electricity consumption, there is actually relatively less rural versus urban and even income category wise variation within states. So we of course are looking at elasticities across states, but when you look at them within states, and within a state, if you look at what is the difference in tariffs and in therefore residential electricity consumption, within state disparities tend to be relatively lower. And what we find, or rather what we suggest, is that this may be because of poor targeting of the residential electricity subsidies. So this is the first finding that we find. And the second is that what is the national level rural price elasticity? That is about negative 0.47. The same for urban households is negative 0.25. So if I were to interpret these numbers, a 10% increase in tariff would reduce the electricity consumption for rural households by about 4.7%. And the same for urban households by about 2.5%. So the reduction for rural households in India is nearly twice as much as it would be for urban households. So this really matters because rural households on average are already consuming less. And if the tariffs were to increase further, then they will be the ones who will be left behind. That's sort of the generic picture that comes out. Now, what we do in this paper is a lot more, and the narrative is actually much bigger than what I'm presenting here, which is that there are too many heterogeneities. So I don't want to leave you with just this generalized picture. I would urge you to also look at the specific between and within state differences that we look at. And the range of rural household elasticity for electricity consumption that we find, it goes from somewhere negative 1.17 in Himachal Pradesh and all the way to a positive 0.64 in Puducherry. So again, the variation across the country is also quite large. So in sum, if I were to say what is the story that is coming out of this, so first is that in terms of targeting, especially the residential electricity subsidies, there needs to be more thought given to that, because they seem to be quite distorted and skewed in favor of urban households. The second is particularly states which can actually also match the supply and to go along with the increasing demand across the country actually, and across rural and urban areas. for those states, actually, there is likely to also be a positive elasticity. And then we also want to highlight that maybe when we think of pricing and when we think of tariffs, one tariff, say for even a state. So what is generally done is that the state electricity board will determine the tariffs. Of course, there are increasing block tariffs according to consumer groups. But then maybe even more granular way of determining tariffs is probably required given the large heterogeneity in the electricity elasticities that we find. So that is what we want to take away from this work. So this is just a graph to show you very quickly how much the variation is. So this is by all the subgroups that we have in our data. So by rural urban and also by low income and high middle income and high income households. So as you can see that there isn't a lot of clustering, and there is sufficient variation between states, and also for rural versus urban households. The second question that I have asked in my recent research is, this is all great. Maybe we can make electricity affordable for rural households. There are also a lot of reforms that have happened in recent years, because of which the access to electricity in rural areas has increased. So the DDU GJY, so that was a big intervention, and because of which at least grid electricity access in a lot of the rural parts of the country has increased. Now, is that indeed so? So on one side, there is a policy intervention, but is that really translating into actual increase in access? If it is that also translating in actual improved quality of supply? And then a related question that we ask is, okay, this is great. You have, maybe there is improved access and maybe also there is improved quality. What does all of this mean for the rural consumers in terms of their satisfaction with the electricity supply? So for this, me and my co-authors, we use the access data, which is collected by CEW. And this was actually jointly done. So, I was also involved in part of the 2018 collection of the data. And it's a panel data set. So what we find here are, the findings are based on approximately 8,500 rural households that were identified in both 2015 and 2018. So they're the same households. So these are actually quite telling in terms of what is happening about access, quality, and satisfaction. So this is the summary of the entire paper. So first is that if you observe the top left graph, there is a big improvement in grid electricity. And the actual numbers, you can access them in the paper. I'll leave you at the very end with the references. So there is definitely an improvement in grid electricity. And this is what we find from the surveys. So in terms of whether the interventions are matching with the outcomes that are expected, seems to be the case. Then on the right, the top right, what you see is how many of the rural households are reporting that they are satisfied with the supply of their electricity. Again, compared to the 2015 round in 2018, there is a big improvement, more than twice the improvement that we see in the number of households that are reporting that they're actually satisfied. Now, where are these really coming from? We see that access has improved, but what else is it that is driving satisfaction? So we look at three things: duration, reliability, and voltage stability. So duration is, we ask, okay, how many hours you get in a 24-hour day in terms of electricity supply. Reliability is in a month. So out of 30 days, how many days do you have a blackout? And stability is out of 30 days, on how many days do you experience a voltage low enough that you cannot run your appliances. So these are the three aspects of quality that we look into, which follows the multi-tier framework, as many of you must be aware of. And what we see is, you will see three graphs at the bottom, panel A, B, and C. So at the very left, panel A is satisfaction with electricity itself. The what is striking here is that duration is what seems to be most important, followed by voltage stability. Reliability, not so much. Then if we look at lighting, so not just electricity supply, but actually the quality of lighting and whether they are satisfied with it, then having, of course, access to electricity definitely matters. But here again, we find that duration and voltage stability stand out compared to reliability. So what does all of this tell? All of this tells that rural consumers' expectations when it comes to electricity supply are now rising. So they have, in terms of their aspirations about the kind of appliances that they want to run in their households, are now catching up. And therefore, for all the people who are planning, more electricity access, also need to think of quality, and also need to think of how they are going to make sure that the rural consumers are served just as well as their urban counterparts. And then this also ties up with what does all of this mean for tariffs? And we have to go back to the other side of the story that, okay, if we have to make sure that we continue supplying good quality electricity to rural areas, then we may have to rethink the way we are doing tariffs, which means heavy subsidies may not be possible, because then that would affect quality and therefore satisfaction. So it's a there are some deep linkages between tariffs and quality and satisfaction, and all of it needs to come together. So those are the thoughts that I'll leave you with, and I'm happy to answer any questions that will come up.
Great, thanks. And both Shonali and Namrata, I think Shonali, you're already doing it, but if there are any specific questions, feel free to answer them in the Q&A box. So that's great. So the third presentation for the day is by Samit Mitra. So we are kind of going from the in a way academics to on-field experience. So he's a senior director at Senior Director Program Implementation at Smart Power India. And SPI has been actively engaged in promoting the uptake of renewable energy microgrids in India by providing direct technical support as well as facilitating and enabling ecosystem. And I think over the last 6 years, they have developed a very rich experience and insights on since they have with the running of almost 150 plus microgrids, if I'm not wrong. So what Samit will focus on today is the demand patterns that they have observed in these microgrids and how they evolve over the time, and what insights that can give us about the factors driving the residential demand. So with that, over to you, Samit.
Right. Thanks, Aditya. A small correction, it's now 500 plus microgrids still in our portfolio. So as Aditya said that the perspective that SPI and I bring in this discussion is from a practitioner's point of view, and more from a consumer's expectations, consumers' behavior, and the kind of demand that we see at a rural level. We are present across 500 mini-grids in the DRE space, and also we work with some discoms across 625 villages. So, the data which we have and the presentation that I'm sharing today is based on the consumer experience across this 1125 villages and over 150,000 connections or customers. Also, I will be using some data which the last 3 years, we have done some research on the access front with Niti Aayog, and also on the consumer behavior with Johns Hopkins University. So, some of the data may be a bit dated, but at least they will show the trend or the direction in which the rural India or the consumers of rural India are moving towards. Yeah, Shruti, next slide, please. Yeah, so as I just shared that, Smart Power India operates on 5 fields, out of which 3 are directly related to the end consumers. One is the mini grid. One is with the utilities of the states of Bihar and Orissa, where we are working on the last mile service deliverables of consumers. And the third is the rooftop enterprises and institutions. And through this program, we are kind of impacting close to 1 million lives and working towards, reducing 25,000 metric tons of CO2 emission, reduction of CO2 emission. Next slide, please. And in this effort, we have various partners, the state discoms, we have private players, we have DRE investors, and also, DFIs like ADBs and World Bank and GIZ are also partnering with us in this, effort. Next slide. So if we, talk of the electricity access landscape, I mean, this is actually rural India's electricity access landscape. As both Sonali and Namrata were talking of, now almost, 100% households, even rural households are, connected to the wire and pole. Every, home is, having, connections, electricity, electrons are moving there. And India's generation capacity is actually in surplus to the demand which is there. But the paradox which is there is that in spite of such a scenario, we are per capita consumption at a national level is only 1/3 of that, the global per capita. And even if we talk of our rural per capita consumption, that is 1/10 of our national average. And, please bear with me that these data are from the villages where we are. So they may be a bit of the actual national data. In the last, 3-4 years, we have made, huge progresses in terms of, building, improving, as well as stabilizing our generation and transmission capacity. And as I said, that all villages across India are today having the TND set up and the infrastructure which can, supply electricity to these villages. And almost, it's 99.98 what the government site says, households are now connected to the grid. But unfortunately, if we look at a rural level, even today, we have villages where, there are 6 to almost 12 hours of power cut. If we talk of the customer behavior and the satisfaction level, what we figured out is, again, what Namrata was saying, our figures are very close to that. About 50% of the consumers are dissatisfied. And, if we talk of, and if we talk of the productive loads which are there in rural India, 42%, actually exactly 42% of enterprises are still dependent on diesel as a primary source of energy. So, in spite of us making huge progress, if we move to a rural scenario, we see a lot of, areas where, improvement is still required, or improvement, there's an opportunity for improvement in those areas. Next slide. Yeah, so this is basically, in a graphical form, what I was just sharing, that, India as a nation is 1/3 of the global average, and the rural India is even, much lower than that. It's just 100 kilowatt per hour, 100 kilowatt hour per capita per annum consumption. Obviously, we are much better than Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's still nothing compared to any of the developing countries' standards. Next slide, please. So, when we talk of rural consumers, and when we, 6 years back, ventured into rural India, into villages with our program, we were conveyed. A lot of these, statements were given to us, a lot of which today looks like myths, but at that time, they were like statements of experienced players. And one of the first thing which was there was that customers are happy with the quality of electricity which they have. But through our experience, through our interactions, we have seen that huge amount of customers are not at all happy with the kind of supply which persists today. The second thing which we were told is that it's good that you are bringing electricity to villages, but you won't be able to impact the per capita consumption. But through our programs, we have seen that if certain things are done right, the per capita consumption, even in a rural setup, do go up, and it goes up substantially. The third thing is that again, this is a point which Namrata was saying, is that today the consumers in rural India are quite aware of the kind of service level that they should expect, and they are actually quite demanding. So we can't ignore that service part of it. That the fourth and the biggest thing which we are told is that you are going to rural India, fine, but be careful that rural consumers don't pay. Either they don't pay on time, or they don't pay at all. I mean, that's the reason discoms are making such huge losses and those kind of things. Our experience has been just the reverse. The portfolio which we manage or which we facilitate, we have a collection efficiency of 99.98%, and they not only pay in full, but they also pay in time. So kind of not improving the service in a rural setup because there are non-payment of customers or financial reasons are just an excuse. I mean, that was our learning, or that has been our learning in the last 3-4 years. Next slide, please. So, if I kind of just put some of our experiences that, we have experienced over the last few years, on the mini-grid space, as I said, that we work on close to 500 odd villages. And what we have seen is that the average per capita consumption of our mini-grid villages is almost double of the rural average. So it's almost close to 220 kilowatt hour. The area in Odisha where we are working with the DISCOM on the grid last mile service part, we have seen the consumption going up by 20%, and it's almost 743 kilowatt hour in that geography, which is much higher than the national average. So our, the main takeaways from these experiences, if I have to tell 3 or 4, experiences, the first one being is that the rural consumers have a certain level of service expectations. We can't take them for granted. And if those service expectations are met and they are met on time, then there is no reason why the consumption can go up, and also why their payment behavior can't improve. Their service expectations are very simple. I mean, they want the bill to be submitted on time. They want a fixed date of a month when somebody will be there to collect their payment. They want somebody to be there to whom they can take their issues and grievances. They want the resolution of those grievances on time. The turnaround time should be within acceptable limits. So these are the small expectations they have, which we as consumers also have the same kind of expectations. So why it should be different in a rural setup? The second thing is in both these geographies, we worked extensively on promoting energy efficient devices or appliances. And many of the villages where we worked, I mean, even a low wattage efficient fan was kind of a novelty at that time. So the villages where we worked, we tried to reach something like a 20% penetration in terms of promoting these energy efficient appliances. And we saw a lot of improvement in terms of the consumption level. Not only consumption level, but it also improved, the stickiness or the attachment of the consumers to those mini grid operators as well as the discom suppliers. So, these are small learnings, and one of the biggest gain I would say is that the utility kind of always craves that we are making losses because we are not able to collect money, and just because we are not able to collect money, we are not able to provide proper service. Proper service is not provided. That's the reason there are customers who default. So it's a cycle, and through our work on the ground along with the utilities as well as the mini grid, we have seen that if done properly, then utility, I mean, if we take the example of the Odisha utility where we worked for a year, I mean, it's still going on, but in 1 year, they collected a revenue which is in addition to almost $1 million in a year. It was 7.2 crore what they collected as an additional revenue without any additional expense. So that is the kind of upside which even a utility, which is an important stakeholder in the whole scheme of things, can gain by providing proper service, by providing timely interventions, and obviously meeting the expectations, the demands of a customer. Thank you.
Thanks, Amit. Great. So as I said, the session now, it's in a way a combination of questions as well as some sort of a panel discussion. So what we can do is maybe start with Shonali. If you have any questions that you, as in the questions that were asked in the chat, if you want to elaborate on any of these. So one round, maybe we'll go with that, Shonali, Namrata, and Samit. And then we do have some set of, I have a few questions myself. So maybe we can follow up with that. So if there are any specific questions that you saw on the chat, which you may want to elaborate, Shonali, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief. I think I tried to answer many of the questions in the chat, maybe not to the satisfaction of everyone, but I think there were a lot of questions regarding assumptions in the scenarios regarding urbanization, income growth, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, details of this can, of course, be found in the publication, but in general, what I wanted to sort of reiterate is that I showed results of mainly the 3 reference scenarios, and these 3 reference scenarios take very different assumptions regarding the projections of income growth, urbanization, population growth, income distribution varies quite dramatically across the 3 scenarios. So in SSP1, you have very rapid economic growth, relatively low population growth, high urbanization, and more equal income distribution. SSP2 is kind of middle of the road, and then SSP3 is more pessimistic. So it's higher population growth, lower urbanization, and lower income growth as well. And of course, a lot of this drives the results that I showed in terms of appliance penetration and electricity demand. Yeah, I hope that clarifies that for many people who seem to have that question. And in terms of price elasticities or price responsiveness, again, we do see differences in the changes in prices for both electricity and complementary supplementary fuels in the 3 scenarios that we consider. Price affects the use of appliances much more than the actual choice to purchase the appliance. So I'll leave it with that, and I'm happy to engage in further discussion afterwards.
Okay, great. Namrata?
Thank you, everyone. So again, I've tried to answer a lot of the questions on the Q&A tab. Broadly, I think the questions are around, well, or at least the ones which struck me are, if tariffs are volatile, and that was one of the questions, and how do you exactly arrive at the right kind of tariff? So I think that's a great question, but my response to that was that although there is variation, there is still a range. So the range that we find in our paper for the entire country is say -1.5 to about +0.5. And if you were to really want to design tariffs better, it is still possible to design them within a certain range. So it's not like you have to, constantly keep thinking of, okay, now how are we going to revise the tariffs from one season to the next. So that's, I understand, that's probably a complicated exercise, but it is possible if you are really sensitive to the elasticities to design them within a specific range and for specific kinds of consumer categories. I think that's the point that we are making right now. It seems to be lumped up quite a lot. So it is more about bringing in a little more granularity rather than saying that, oh, you keep changing it from one season to another or 1 year to the next. And that was one question that struck me. And the second was about, well, do you know anything about the willingness to pay? And that is where I think Sumit's study is probably very relevant. So you're saying that the rural consumers, they are getting better access and have better quality of supply and therefore are satisfied. But how does all of this translate into willingness to pay when your first study actually shows that the elasticity for rural consumers is negative? And I think that's a great question as well, to be able to connect these things. So while it is negative, what we conjecture, and I say conjecture is because we did not design it as a contingent valuation study to extract the willingness to pay estimates, but we do think that if matched with supply, and that too with quality supply, rural consumers are actually willing to pay. There is, in terms of the demand growth, and you showed the projections yourself, when Shweta, when she was making her presentation. So there is likely to be growth. And if given quality supply, rural consumers would be willing to pay, although that is a study which we would really like to undertake in the near future. So I think great questions overall. And then there were some questions about the specific aspects of the study in terms of the modeling and the sample and so on, which I have tried to address in the chats.
Okay, great. Sumit, I'm not sure if you did get time to look through the questions, but did you? Do you have anything specific to elaborate on?
I did get time to see the questions, but I couldn't answer them online. So, I will just take them up. So I will club questions which are similar, looking and on talking about the same comment. Yeah. So one was that how the per capita consumption is calculated. I mean, obviously it's based on, consumption and the number of members in a family over a 365-day period. So that's how the per capita was calculated in our case. Do you use prepaid model? And this is talking of meters. And there was also another question is that on the smart meters, that what is the granularity of electricity data collected? So, rightly we use smart meters, and so the data is obviously real time. It's I think it's every 15 seconds the data is captured, and you can dice the data the way you want it. You can slice the data whichever way you want it, and it's a great tool to have the meters. And what we have done is that we have developed an in-house data management system which we call IMCOMS, which does all the analysis for us, and depending on the requirement of each developer, whatever kind of reports they want, they can get it out of there. Then there was a very interesting question is that, I think Namrata also, answered that question. I would just like to add to the tariff part is that what our experience has been is that in a rural setup, usually they obviously look at the per unit cost, but at the same time, when we are supplying through our mini grid, they consider it as a backup, and they consider it with their alternate expense, which otherwise would have happened if they had met that demand through, say, a kerosene or a diesel backup. So it's not exactly an apple-to-apple comparison, which they do in terms of the grid supply cost as well as the cost of energy through a mini grid, but they do compare it with what would their cost otherwise would have been if they had if they didn't have the grid, the mini grid, connections. So most of the mini grid operators for residential customers, they do prepaid billing, and they have packages which talks of a certain hours of supply in a day over a period, and it's a fixed cost which they pay in a month. So it's not a per unit rate. And as I said, that they compared this with their candle or a kerosene, or for that matter, a diesel cost, if it would have been there. There was one more question. Do the mini grids require demand behaviors from consumers? Do you tell them to do things at certain times of day, change appliances to help manage demand? It's an ongoing thing. See, the supply side for a mini grid is standard. There are a lot of players who can come and put up a mini grid. The challenge is always managing demand. Studying and understanding the load curve of a day. When your solar is available at what time. I mean, your LCA for the day is very different than from the night where you have storage things. So as a developer, you try to maximize your day's production, and you can't change too much of behavior in terms of the time of day use, but you can have differential prices for day and for night. You can also, and each of the developers also promote, energy efficient devices, so that they don't have surges, they don't have huge fluctuations of voltages, and those kind of don't impact the mini grid supplies. So demand is the side where each mini grid operator works extensively. I think any other? Aditya, I think I have answered most of them.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Samit. So we do have a few set of questions, and maybe I can start with you, Samit, since we are already discussing it. One thing it would be interesting to know, in fact, 2 or 3 things. One is this 494 villages that you talked about. I think a lot of them also do have a grid coming to it. So they are not in a way off-grid systems. So that is one. So how does that integration, or how does that switching happen? Not technically, but what are the behavioral patterns, consumer behavior around that? That is one. Second is, what kind of loads households have, as in what kind of appliances do they use? Do they go beyond lights and fans? And then what is, in a way, what is called the appliance ladder? Which do they buy first and then later? So those were the 2 things. And third, if you can talk a little bit on the utility model, because the second panel that you had, elaborate a little bit on that.
Right. I mean, sorry, your first was whether these villages where we are connected to the grid or not. I mean, 100% of our villages are having a government grid, and in no way we see that as a competition, or the mini grid cannibalizing on the grid supply or anything like that. The way we want to think, or the way we have seen the consumers, the mini grid, is they complement it to the existing grid. In terms of behavior, the rural consumers, we tend to underestimate them, but they are very smart, and they find out the best way in which they can bring down their blended cost. So what we have seen is that when we started in 2015, many residential or households used to have mini grid as their main source. But with Saubhagya and penetration of government grid going up at the residential level, they moved mini grid as a backup. So grid became their primary source of energy, and the mini grid, they kept it as a backup. In productive uses, the thing has not changed much, because the quality when I say quality, I'm talking of the reliability and the regularity of supply has not improved much. So as I said that, the 40% of enterprises, small enterprises, are still dependent on diesel. So those are the customers who, kind of got connected to the mini grid by replacing diesel. So for them, mini grid is still the primary source of energy, whereas for the households, we are kind of a backup. Your second question was in terms of appliances. So what we have seen is that if I take a a village, a sample village, you're close to 150 out of 400. So that's like close to 35-36% of the village will be having fan, bulbs, and mobile charging as their only application. Then as you move up the ladder, you will see that there are small appliances now which has made inroads. So this 35-36% even have a TV. So then with the LEDs coming in where the wattages are low, with various MFIs offering now easy installments. So TV is the second product which has entered the village households. And at the top end, you will find some villages or some households which will also have refrigerators. So that will be close to maybe 20 odd households in a village, which is roughly 5%. ACs, I mean, it's very difficult to put a percentage to that at this point in time. So this is the kind of breakup that we have experienced in the states and the villages that we are present. On our work with the grid, so actually Orissa regulator approached us to work with one of their discom in central Orissa in the Paradip belt, the very cyclone prone area. And their main objective of that at that time, that how to bring in women village level entrepreneurs to do the meter billing and collection. So that was their whole objective. So Orissa has a very strong self-help group system in place. So and their thing was that bring your learnings from mini-grid and see if you can make any changes in the grid or the utility operations, last mile operations. So we started working across the 625 villages. We selected 161 women from these self-help groups, took them through some training, capability building, and all those things. And they have been working for the last 12 months. So, and they are known in the local language as Bijli Didi. So what happened is that these women were from the villages, and they were knowing each and every household or each and every consumer quite intimately. So they being there, they became much more approachable than the the billing or the metering guy who used to come from some far off place previously. And this woman had this drive in them that they want to bring in some additional income for their family. So they made their own permanent journey plans. They worked out the system through which they will be approaching each and every household twice a month. They made it a point to raise all the concern of their respective consumers to the DISCOM and get them resolved. And in a period of 3-4 months, we started seeing quite a decent improvement in the meter and collection part of it. So the regulator, when they brought in the program, they didn't expect that it's going to improve the metering and billing. Their expectation was that getting some, 160, 170 women employed. And at the end of the program, as I said, the DISCOM realized that they have generated an additional revenue of $1 million. Not only that, this 161 women who were working as Bijli Didis, they ended up earning close to $1 lakh, I mean 8,500 per month, each of them during these 12 months, which is a substantial amount considering that where the family's total income per month is the tune of used to be in the tune of 10,000. So yeah, these were some of our experiences and learning, and it was a big satisfaction for us that at the end of the 12 months when this woman came back, is that not only they earned money, but they were empowered and they got a lot of respect from the community where they worked.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I'll come back to you with a few more questions, but coming to Shonali, a couple of questions related to one is the assumptions part is yes, but also the modeling part and the methods used for modeling, because your paper talks about how most of the literature does assume a linear relationship between income and electricity demand, but your method, it goes much beyond that. Maybe a little bit on that, on the method and how that can be, as in how, or what kind of additional insights that give as compared to the linear income elastic, the relation, linear income relation. That is one. And second is, in the modeling, we do have a lot of smart meter data coming up. So what role do you see that data and the machine learning algorithms or that to play in the projecting and the models? Just a couple of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Aditya. Good questions. So a little bit about the methods we used, I can describe in brief. So what we used is something called a structural econometric approach, which is basically a relatively new methodology, whereby we're basically using nationally representative household surveys and using these to estimate parameters of our model, which are things like responsiveness to income, growth, price, urbanization, household characteristics, and so on and so forth. And then we simulate populations that are representing the entire population distribution. So the entire income distribution, the entire demographic distribution of a particular country, region. And then based on the SSPs in our case, or whatever scenarios you're considering, the projections on income, household size changes, urbanization changes, population changes, we simulate these populations in the future and use the estimated parameters to really look at how things will develop in the future. So the advantage of this is that it's capturing a lot more of the heterogeneity in the population structure. So in other words, you're not assuming that preferences and the estimates for a low-income household are the same as a high-income household, or that for an urban is the same as a rural household. You're really trying to capture a lot more of the heterogeneity. And that's why we call it a very granular approach to modeling. And at the same time, it allows you to also test the responsiveness of different kinds of strategies, whether they are price-based or income-based or efficiency improvements or whatever, for these different categories of households, right, for the entire distribution of households. So that's in brief a little bit about the methodology. Your second question, just remind me, I kind of have lost track of, but
the smart meter data.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a really exciting opportunity because, of course, it gives you a lot of granularity in terms of the electricity use characteristics of different types of households. I think the challenge lies in sort of combining the smart meter data with other socioeconomic and demographic data so that you can really try to start teasing out the relationships of how these different factors affect that demand. And I mean, of course, there are all these new techniques, machine learning and so on that you mentioned. I think there are also opportunities of sort of combining Earth observation, satellite-based data with some of this smart metering, if we know geolocation of some of this information, for example, to really do quite innovative and granular estimations and modeling to really understand also how this might vary by region, by climate, by different development levels in different regions. So I mean, I think there's a huge potential out there for really trying to do more innovative analysis in this space. Of course, in some cases, the challenges are really combining different types of data sources to really understand the key drivers of these changes that we see and the patterns that we observe.
Yeah, thanks. So, Namrata, a couple of questions for you. One was related to, in a way, it's a very difficult question to answer, but when all the surveys are in a way perception based, and so what people say and what people do, and so how do you think the elasticities in your calculations? How exactly to account for that? I mean, is there any kind of anecdotal or other methods that you have used? So that was one. And second is also related to this whole quality of supply and customer satisfaction. I mean, do you see any relation between quality of supply and then also not only with the use of appliances, but whether it affects the purchase of appliances in the first place? As in, if you have a perception that the quality of supply is going to be bad, I won't buy a particular appliance at all.
Thank you, Aditya. So the first question about, say, how reliable are these estimates? Should we take them with a pinch of salt? How much faith should we put in these elasticities? So I have a sort of couple of responses. First is just the kind of range of data that we are able to use to estimate the elasticities is much more than what has been done by any of the earlier studies, just on India. Okay, I'm not talking about elsewhere, just on India. Yes, there are household surveys. Yes, they are self-reported data. But even then, I think enough kind of reliability studies have been done on the NSSO itself for us to then put our faith in those questions and what they are capturing. Plus the like I said, the range of the NSSO rounds that we are able to use. Then also the modeling that we do. Unlike some of the earlier studies which have looked at a logarithmic relationship, we look at a quadratic relationship and then also try to defend that as to why that's a better fit for our data. And then the third thing that we do is that we have a little table in our paper comparing our estimates to other studies done on India and also other studies done on countries similar to India. So what have been the elasticities found in China, for instance? And we are not too far off in terms of the estimates. So if we were to then come back to the question, are they reliable? I would say fairly. And that would be my response to that. The second about ownership of or rather purchase of appliances, that is not something that was the focus of the Access survey in particular. You yourself were using the IRIS, and I think the IRIS is better suited to answer that question about purchase of appliances. We do find a correlation between ownership, so existing ownership and quality, which are the variables that are there in the survey. But whether or not improved quality would then urge people to purchase more appliances, unfortunately, I don't want to jump the gun and say that our data were actually able to answer that question. And I would just leave it at that.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Samit, coming back to you, you did mention on energy efficient appliances and going beyond LED bulbs. So one question would be, what do you think the current market is for energy efficient appliances, and particularly in rural areas? What is the awareness about these appliances, and what is the willingness to pay for those appliances, and how does it relate to what kind of electricity they are using? So that's one. And a related question is also, one of the things that is being pushed for is these EVs, the electric vehicles and induction cook stoves. Do you see any kind of adoption or any kind of perception that the villages that you have presence in, any insights on that?
Right. Talking of the energy efficient appliances, as I said, that our experience across this, where we are working, we have seen there is the adoption percentage or the penetration percentage is close to 20%, slightly below 20%. One thing what we have to understand is if we are talking of, say, a TV or a fridge, the aspirations of the rural consumers are quite high, and they are quite brand conscious. So why I'm saying this is that when we launched this program, our perception was that in such a setup, the geography where we are working, it will be better if we can bring in a cheaper and affordable kind of a TV. And we sourced some TV from China at 6,000 odd rupees, 32-inch TV. And at the same time, just to give an option, we also took a TV of a branded company, and that time it was costing somewhere around 12,500. And we were surprised that none of those Chinese TVs were picked up by any of the consumers. They personally feel that when they're buying a TV or a fridge, it's, as I said, it's an aspirational purchase. It's a purchase which they would like to show off to their neighbors. And typically, when I have visited these rural households, I have seen that the TV or fridge will have a place of importance in the drawing room, and you will come across that as soon as you enter. So they will prefer a TV or a fridge, or for that matter any brand which they have come across either in a TV commercial or a newspaper ad. So brands like LG, Samsung, Sony has a much higher recall value to them than maybe a cheaper brand. Now with MFI is also extending small loans beyond their previous mandates, have also enabled a lot of these village households to buy these under small monthly EMIs. So that has been our learning. So now whatever energy efficient products we promote, we make sure that they are branded and well-known brands. So that was the first. And the second question, can you just repeat, Aditya? Age is catching up. Sorry, you mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Before coming to the second question, so did you say the people do use the financing options quite frequently? Is that what you said in the first?
Yeah. So the thing is that in the villages where we are, we have only connected them to NBFs, not NBFCs actually, is MFIs or other financial institutes. So because otherwise they don't have too many credit histories and civil scores for them to approach appliance financing organizations. So MFIs is one option, and for all these close to 10,000 odd appliances that we have sold in these markets, almost 90% have availed MFI loans.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks. So my second question was people's any kind of approaches to these newer end users, be it electric vehicles or induction cook stoves. Do you see any kind of awareness or any kind of perception toward these end users?
Yeah. Recently, we have seen a high adoption of induction cook stoves, especially in districts like Samastipur, Begusarai, Muzaffarpur. Unfortunately, a mini grid system don't support that, because what happens is that in village, usually the cooking times are the same. All induction cooking systems starting at the same time kind of trips the mini grid. So we can't support it en masse. But what we have seen is that there is we are seeing adoption of induction cooker in central Bihar specifically. In terms of there are sporadic cases of EVs being used in Jharkhand, in areas of Orissa. I mean, Orissa, they call it tuk-tuk, the local thing, which are battery operated autos. But I mean, I don't think in a rural setup there is too many, but I have seen a few. It's still early days. The main challenge is charging stations and charging systems.
Okay. Okay. Good. So I have one question, maybe for all three, and so gender is one important aspect in energy access. I mean, we all know, and there has been a lot of research related to role of gender, particularly related to cooking. But about these kind of higher use appliances, let's say refrigerator, air conditioner, air cooler, or even TVs for that matter, what role do you think gender may play in the decision making of both the purchase of the appliances and use of its use? That's one. And second is also, is there any way, I mean, how do you model or in your projections, how do you incorporate it? So that's a general question, and it's not related to the presentations that you have made, but because maybe Shonali and Namrata, you have worked on gender-related issues. If you have any kind of insights on that, it would be very great.
Yeah, I could go first on that. So this is an important question. I think the question of gender and access to energy services has been increasingly focused on in recent years. I mean, I think there are several aspects related to this question, but one of the key things is, of course, who has the decision-making power in the house. And in Indian society, in South Asian society, we know it's largely patriarchal, and at the moment there is still a lot of the decision making regarding sort of big purchases like appliances and so on with male head of household rather than with women. And that's reflected, I think, very much in the kind of appliance penetration you see. So things like a television or a radio transistor or appliances that in some ways might benefit men more than women are likely to be bought before others. So for example, you don't see very often that a grinder mixie is given preference in the purchase decision over a television. And I think this is kind of reflective of the differences in the power relationships between genders that currently exist. But in terms of modeling, I mean, I think there are many interesting avenues for sort of looking at these relationships. For instance, by looking at, I mean, a lot of the surveys do collect information on the education level of women in the home. And there has been past research that shows that more highly educated women are more likely to have a voice in decision-making in the home. There are also studies that suggest that women being employed makes a difference in terms of their ability to make decisions in the home and on the choice of appliances that get purchased. So when women are working out of the home and the farm, then appliances that can save them time, the appliances of convenience, take a higher preference, take a higher. So I mean, these are things that I think can be analyzed with the kind of data that already exists. And I think these are questions that are increasingly important to understand in order to sort of also make better analysis of potential future growth of electricity demand and so on.
Yeah, so well, I mean, this just opens up so many things that I have worked on and continue to work on. So I have both sort of good news to share and bad news to share. Maybe I'll begin with the bad news. So in one of the recent papers where me and my co-authors, we looked at willingness to pay for exclusive use of LPG. I know you mentioned cooking and electricity are different, but we found that women being either the main or the joint decision makers was insignificant. in the willingness to pay for LPG. And this is again using the access data, which is, in terms of the coverage and all is quite extensive. So that is one. The second piece of bad news that I have is that there is another study that I'm working on right now. Don't have very concrete results, but the preliminary story that is emerging. So this is a time use data set which has been released. It's also, so it's called Time Use Survey, NCAER. So MOSPI essentially releases it. It's modeled around the NSSO data as well. So it's 2019 coverage. And what seems to happen is, so there is one question, do you have energy access? And if you correlate that with time use, definitely having energy access changes the time that women spend on a lot of household chores, but it does not change their overall time use, in terms of time spent on other responsibilities expected within the household. So somehow energy access makes no difference to like the bigger gender dynamics as one would expect. The whole story around empowerment, and that's not really clearly coming out. So seems like it just shifts their responsibility within the household, but it does not really empower them very much. Like I said, very preliminary. And I'm digging in more into the data, but it's a massive data set. So have to look into it a bit more. And interestingly, there is a smaller component that they collected in 98, which allows for some comparative. So it's not a panel, it's a repeated cross section, but allows for some comparisons to be done over nearly 20 years that have passed. Now, is there any good news? Well, I would sort of concur with Shonali on some of the studies which say that yes, women decision makers do matter. But here again, I'm just going to say sort of, a bit ambiguously that even looking at a household as a singular household is not right when it comes to the relationship between gender and energy. So the entire household is a gendered space. So will a fan in the kitchen be prioritized over a fan in the living room or in the front yard? Now, all of those questions start to emerge. And therefore, we really have to go into different kinds of data collection methods. So this is something that again I'm working with colleagues here at IIMA. It has to do more with mobile phones, so not appliances, but mobile phones. But there we have to rely on what are called vignettes, and not just like simple yes or no objective questions, but giving respondents various scenarios. And telling them, okay, in this scenario, this is how the dynamics might change. In this scenario, the woman might actually be able to get some work, paid work, and so on, and then really try to get responses around what does owning a mobile phone really mean. And I think that is so that is like the good news, if I were to share, that if we change the way data are collected, maybe we will get a much deeper, a richer narrative around the relationship between gender and energy and appliance and empowerment and so on.
Okay, great. Yeah, the bad news kind of dominated the good news, but still, so Samit, I know you have to leave, but just, what are your observations on the field? What do you see the role of gender and?
Right. So I have a very funny experience on that front, and again, the perceptions with which we go are so different, and basically what Sonali and Namrata both said, that is exactly what I have experienced in UP and Bihar, which are typically patriarchal society. But when we work in Jharkhand, our area of operation was Gumla, which is like a predominantly tribal area. And there we saw that, it's a much more gender equal society than what we have seen in UP and Bihar. Maybe less educated, maybe the earnings per family are much less, but the respect for each other is much, much higher there. And, if we look at the appliances which were adapted in UP Bihar, it was predominantly TV. Whereas if we look at what happened in Gumla, it was predominantly refrigerator. And we have some videos even on our website So there was this lady whom I met, and that's the first time I was meeting her. And I just asked her that, you don't have a TV, so why you bought a refrigerator? And her reply was that, now I only have to cook once a day. And, I don't have to, sit before my chula twice a day making food for my kids. So that's the kind of, and that's in a sense is empowerment that, it's freeing up this lady's evening where she may take up something else. But yeah, that has been our, experience across the geography.
Okay, great. So I think on that slightly positive note, maybe we can close. We are 3 minutes above our time, which is, I think, okay. So thanks, Shonali, Namrata, and Samit. It was very useful, very interesting, and very insightful discussions. Of course, 1.5 hours is always less to discuss all aspects related to your work as well as the broader rural residential demand. We will keep on doing these discussions in the future, and we'll continue doing these kind of roundtables. And we will be recording this, and the link will be available. So thanks everyone, and don't forget there's a second session of this roundtable. It's on 7th of October, next Thursday, same time. So please do join us then. It's on another important topic of demand response and opportunities for demand response in Indian homes. So great. Thank you everyone for joining, and thanks again, Shonali, Namrata, and Samit.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thanks.
for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.